The strongest bone in the human body is your femur, your thigh bone. It takes enormous force to break it. The kind you'd see in a high-speed car crash or a fall from a great height. But on a quiet training road in San Marino, in the summer of 2022, a teenager, just 18 years old, found that force in a patch of loose gravel. His bike slid out on a blind curve. He hit a concrete barrier, and in a single silent second, the strongest bone in his body snapped clean in two. And something far worse tore open with it. A major artery in his right leg. Right there on the pavement, this kid was quietly bleeding toward death. The doctors gave him 6 to 9 months just to walk again. Not to race, to walk. 3 years later, that same kid stood on the final podium of the Tour de France, the biggest bike race on Earth. Third overall, in his very first tour, and the first Mexican in history to get there. I'm Sebastian, and this is the Injury Breakdown. Today we answer one impossible question. How does a body come back from the edge of death and turn into a machine that terrifies the professional peloton? The answer hides inside a single number his own team refuses to make public. Stay with me. By the end, you'll understand why they guard it and what his numbers on the mountain reveal anyway. So let's go back to that road. Because to understand the comeback, you have to understand how close Isaac del Toro came to never racing again. When you fracture a femur, the broken bone is only half the emergency. Your femur runs right alongside the femoral artery, one of the largest blood vessels in your body. Think of it like a fire hose. When that jagged bone tore into it, he started losing blood so fast, his red blood cell count dropped toward critical levels. And here's what matters for an athlete. Red blood cells carry oxygen. They are the entire currency of endurance sport. So he wasn't just losing blood. He was losing the exact machinery a cyclist spends his whole life building. Picture it. A kid from Ensenada, a small city in Baja California, Mexico, a country with almost no cycling tradition, lying on a road in a foreign land, his dream and his blood draining out at the same time. He admitted later that in the first minutes, he cried. Not from the pain, from the certainty that everything he'd worked for was slipping away. But here's a question before we go on. If a doctor told you it would take 9 months just to walk, how long would you give yourself to run? To sprint? To climb a mountain on a bike faster than almost anyone alive? Hold that answer. Because Del Toro refused to accept any of it. 25 days. That's how soon after breaking his femur Del Toro was back in physical therapy, logging 5-6 hours of rehab in a single stretch. Not because it felt good, but because every day he waited, his body was betraying him, in a way most people never think about. Here's the science they don't show in the highlight reels. When an endurance athlete stops moving, the collapse is brutal and fast. Your VO2 max, the maximum oxygen your body can use, the single best measure of your aerobic engine, can drop around 7% in just the first 2 weeks of inactivity. And your muscles start to shrink almost immediately. So Del Toro wasn't only healing a bone, doctors swore needed months. He was racing his own physiology, rebuilding an engine that was dissolving underneath him. The doctors said 6 to 9 months to walk. He was walking in under 3. That same year he was back on the bike. And the year after, in 2023, this kid who'd been bleeding out on a training road won the Tour de l'Avenir. If you don't follow cycling, that name means nothing. So let me tell you why it should stop you cold. The Tour de l'Avenir means the Tour of the Future. It's the unofficial Under-23 World Championship, the most accurate crystal ball in the sport. Win it, and you're marked as a future superstar. Past champions include Tadej Pogačar, the greatest rider of his generation, and Egan Bernal, who went on to win both the Tour de France and the Giro d'Italia. And Del Toro became the first Mexican in history to win the Tour de l'Avenir. So the kid who couldn't walk didn't just come back. He announced himself as the future of the sport. But being the future and being a champion are two different things, and the gap between them is measured in a number. Which brings us to the weapon. When a mountain road tilts toward the sky, cycling stops being about brute strength and starts being about one ruthless ratio. Watts per kilogram, power, divided by weight. Let me make it simple. Going uphill, your number one enemy is gravity. You're lifting your body and your bike against the slope, and gravity does not care how famous you are. At climbing speeds, you move slowly enough that aerodynamics barely matters. So the rider who pushes the most power for every kilogram of body weight wins. It's not opinion, it's physics. And physics doesn't negotiate. This is why Del Toro is terrifying on a climb. He weighs around 60 kilograms. He's tiny. To be world class, a climber has to hold around 6 to 6.5 watts per kilo and hold it for 20, 30, even 40 minutes of suffering. For a rider his size, that's roughly 360 to 390 watts, sustained, while his lungs are on fire. A bigger, more powerful rider might make more raw power, but drag that weight up a mountain, and it becomes an anchor. Del Toro's tiny frame turns him into a rocket, pointed straight up. Now the number his team hides. I promised you a single figure they refuse to release, and here's the truth, because this channel doesn't invent facts. His exact VO2 max has never been made public, and that silence isn't an accident. In modern cycling, where the top riders are separated by fractions of a percent, your physiology is a military secret. Teams guard these numbers like gold, because to reveal your ceiling is to reveal your weakness. So here's what we do know. The professional elite live between 70 and 85 milliliters of oxygen per kilogram per minute. The freaks of the general classification, the overall standings, push toward the high 80s and even 90. Pogačar is rumored near the top of that range, though even that has never been confirmed. But here's the twist that separates real analysts from casual fans. VO2 max is only the ceiling. It's just the size of the engine. What actually wins races is how much of that ceiling you can hold without blowing up, your lactate threshold, and how efficiently you burn fuel. A giant engine you can't hold at redline is useless. And Isaac del Toro? He can sit right at the redline. So he has the comeback. He has the engine. He has the weapon. There's one problem left. And it's one no lab test can measure. Because sometimes the biggest thing standing between Del Toro and history is his own team. Here's the cruel irony at the center of this story. Isaac del Toro rides for UAE Team Emirates, arguably the most powerful team in the world. And that's both the best and the worst thing that could have happened to him. The best, because they have everything. The sports science, the altitude camps, the resources, the security, and a front row seat to learn from the greatest rider of his generation. But the worst, because that greatest rider, Tadej Pogačar, is on his team. And a team can only have one leader at the biggest races. Which means at the Tour de France, Del Toro isn't allowed to chase his own glory. He's ordered to spend his body in the service of someone else. It's a golden cage. So what does that cost him, physiologically? More than you'd think. Being a domestique, a support rider, is savage work. You ride on the front. You cut the wind for your leader. You close down gaps. You drop back to the car to carry water bottles. And riding out in the open, exposed to the wind, can demand as much as 30% more power than sitting protected in the slipstream behind another wheel. Meanwhile, the leader sits in that shelter, sipping his energy, saving everything. Every rider has a finite number of matches to burn, hard maximal efforts, before the body is empty. And a domestique burns his matches for someone else. So when you're told to switch roles mid-race, you go to war with a half-empty tank. Which makes what happened at the Tour de France in 2026 almost impossible to believe. On the second stage, into Barcelona, Del Toro was sent up the road to work, to burn his matches for Pogačar. But instead, he found himself at the front, with the win in sight. And in the final meters, Pogačar, the leader, the man he was supposed to be serving, looked over and lifted his foot off the pedal. He gifted the stage to the kid from Ensenada. And that one win rewrote the history books. Because with it, Del Toro became just the second Mexican in history to win a stage of the Tour de France, breaking a drought of 36 years. The last man to do it was Raúl Alcala back in 1989 and 1990. Alcala also finished 8th overall at the Tour, twice. And for over 3 decades, that 8th place stood as the ceiling. The best any Mexican had ever managed in the overall standings, until this summer. So there's one last piece to this story, and it's the one that gives me chills as a physical therapist. Because here, history doesn't just rhyme, it targets the exact same leg. In April of 2026, at a race in the Basque Country, Del Toro crashed again. And this time, he tore a muscle in his right thigh. The same right leg that had been shattered 4 years earlier. It forced him out of the race, the first abandon of his professional career, and threw his whole Tour de France into doubt. A muscle tear is graded from 1 to 3, depending on how many fibers are torn, from a mild strain to a near-complete rupture. So think about where that left him. A torn thigh in April, the biggest race on Earth in July. And what he did there wasn't a comeback. It was history. In Paris, Isaac del Toro finished 3rd overall in his very first Tour de France. The first Mexican ever to stand on that podium. He won the white jersey as the Tour's best young rider. And he did it while fighting through illness in the final week. So sick he could barely hold the wheels, clinging to 3rd anyway. But here's the part that breaks the whole story open. Remember the golden cage? The teammate who was supposed to hold him back? On the hardest mountain stages, Tadej Pogačar, the man in yellow, the winner of the entire Tour, turned around and rode as a domestique for Del Toro. The best cyclist in the world gave up his own shot at more stage wins, drove to the front, and dragged his young teammate toward that podium. The cage didn't trap him, it lifted him. And at the finish, Del Toro was crying again. Not on a road in San Marino, bleeding out at 18. This time on the podium of the Tour de France. So think about what this one body has done. It broke the strongest bone a human has. It bled to the edge. It rebuilt an engine that was dissolving in real time. It did the whole thing again, on the same leg. And it still climbed onto the podium of the greatest race on Earth. His VO2 max is still a secret. Maybe it always will be. But the number that told this story was never in a lab. It was 6 to 9 months, the time a doctor gave a bleeding teenager to walk, against the 3 years it took him to fly. There's one question left. He's proven he can reach the podium in service of another man. So when does Isaac del Toro finally get to chase the yellow jersey for himself? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I want to know what you think. I'm Sebastian, and this has been The Injury Breakdown. Now, if you want to know what really separates the 3 greatest cyclists alive, I put Pogačar, Vingegaard, and Evenepoel through 6 lab tests. VO2 max, climbing power, time trial, sprint, efficiency, and durability to find out who actually wins. The answer isn't who you'd expect. And the man with the biggest engine doesn't take home the most titles. It's on screen now. Go watch it. I'll see you there.